Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of ZagsAPush, live from the Underground Garage. Today is Period 3 Day. We will be breaking down the AP time Period 3, that's 1754 through 1800. So, get out your Ticonderoga number 2 pencils, get out your notebook, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and let's rock and roll. So, 1754 through 1800 is the time period that we're talking about. Again, that's Period 3 in our APUSH curriculum. And what we're looking at here is the French and Indian War through the Adams administration. But before we get to the French and Indian War, let's backtrack a little bit. Let's talk about that pre-French and Indian War British-American colonies relationship. Now, economically, we know that it is a mercantilistic state, okay? The colonies are there to benefit the mother country. Socially and politically, what we start to see here is this ideology of salutary neglect, and that's Britain's unofficial policy to relax the enforcement of strict regulations, most notably trade laws. They had the Navigation Acts, but again, these laws were very lenient, okay? The enforcement of these laws were very lenient. If we connect back to Carol Birkin, it all goes back to that notion that the British did their colonizing on the cheap. So while they were still making money out of the result of the mercantilistic state, they were very lenient on the enforcement of the Navigation Acts, and smuggling became the national pastime. And if smuggling was the national pastime, then John Hancock was the Babe Ruth of this industry of smuggling goods from the American colonies through really the whole eastern seaboard, Europe, the Caribbean, wherever the case may be. In addition to smuggling and the lack of enforcement with economic policy, the British also had a lack of enforcement with political policy. And the British really, as a result of just the sheer gap in geography, you have roughly 3,000 miles separating the seat of the empire in Great Britain to the American colonies. The American colonies became a semi-autonomous region. The British allowed them basically to practice their own forms of government. So everything was very internal, everything was very local. We see that as the prime example of the Virginia House of Burgesses. And the British and the Americans enjoyed this social, political, and economic situation up until the French and Indian War. And as I like to call the French and Indian War, that's the aha moment of the American identity. So what do we have going on here that starts this French and Indian War? Well, you had the British American colonists encroaching on the Ohio River Valley, and you also had French settlers that were already there. That was their region, that was their sphere of influence, if you want to call it something like that. But what we're going to see is that these two are going to start to clash. Plus the fact that who was already living there in that region and all of North America? The American Indians. So again, this connects back to our friend, scholar Ned Blackhawk, where all internal conflict in the North American continent has started in the interior portions of it. And the Ohio River Valley is no different. The French and Indian War is no different. Now, this is the aha moment. So, in the end, the French lose. The French are then basically expelled out of North America, and the British now have acquired this massive land. So now their empire is stretching basically from the American East Coast to the Mississippi River. In addition to acquiring a massive tract of land from the French, they've also acquired now a massive amount of war debt. And this is where we're going to start to see the aha moment. So, by 1754 through 1763, you have the French and Indian War. By 1763 now, what you're starting to see is the end of salutary neglect, and we're looking at a much more stricter enforcement and much more tightening of the tightening of the rope, so to speak, between the British and their North American colonies. So the British grip down at the end of salutary neglect. And what I want you to look at in the description, you could look at this Gilder Lehrman timeline that they do on the American Revolution, and they do a fantastic job by doing that. But we've talked about in previous videos on the American Revolution, the slew of taxes and different laws and actions that Parliament is going to bestow upon the American colonies. But for this period 3 review, I want to look at 2. One is the Proclamation Line of 1763. That starts it all off, okay? That is where you're starting to see where once the French and Indian War is over, these colonists want to really expand out west. They were looking to go into the Ohio River Valley, and as a result of that, they're going to have conflict with the American Indians that are already living there and that were once allied with the French. So rather than fighting another war and paying for another war in the American interior, the British are going to take a time out, so to speak, and look at this and say, here's what we're going to do. The American colonists that have moved there have got to come back to the 13 colonies east of the Appalachian Mountains. And we are therefore going to close down. We're going to put an imaginary line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and we're going to forbid any groups from establishing a Western homestead. They're separating the American Indians from the white settlers because they do not want to have any conflict. And they're also starting to see now that the American colonies are starting to look a lot different. This is the first time during the French and Indian War where you're starting to have British officials, high-level governmental officials in the American colonies for the first time. So they're trying to get the colonies back on track for the English way. So you have the Proclamation Line. In addition to the Proclamation Line, you're going to have in 1765 one of the earliest taxes. Okay, you had the Sugar Act, and now you're going to have the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act of 1765 is basically a tax on all legal documents. So newspapers, wills, marriage certificates, death certificates, whatever the case may be, it's got to have the British stamp of approval on it. The colonists now this is one of the earliest times that the colonists are being taxed directly from Mother England. Previously, they dealt more locally with their colonial legislators, i.e. the House of Burgesses, for example. Now you're getting a direct tax from the king. Their argument is going to be, well, as Englishmen, we need to have representation in Parliament. So the battle cry for here is going to be no taxation without representation. Britain comes back and basically justifies their argument by saying that you have representation, you have what we call virtual representation. And virtual representation is the body of Parliament is going to be looking out for the best interests of the colonies. Now, as a result of the Stamp Act crisis, as a result of the Proclamation Line, you're going to have colonial blowback from this. You're going to have colonial pushback. There's going to be protests. You're going to have groups such as the Sons of Liberty. You're going to have the Daughters of Liberty. You're going to have the role of women begin to change. And in these early stages of the American Revolution, women are going to play a vital role in the call for repeal of these acts. Women is going to be, once they start putting on these non-importation agreements or an 18th century version of a boycott, the women are the ones that are purchasing products. So now they're going to have to transition from purchasing products from England or purchasing goods, the raw materials from England. Everything is going to have to be done on their own. And they're going to spin their own clothing. They're going to make different types of herbal teas rather than importing British tea. So it's going to be a very daunting task for the women living in the colonies. And their feeling is going to be, well, if we're going to be looking for change from Great Britain, political change, why can't women now start to think of social change for themselves? Which is a very interesting notion that Carol Birkin goes into depth on with her book, Revolutionary Mothers. Now, during this time period, the Enlightenment ideas are going to be flowing. So you have John Locke, who would be very influential with Jefferson and his ideology of two treaties of government. And you have Rousseau and Montesquieu. So you have all these Enlightenment thinkers. But still, the call for independence is not there. It's not like the king puts on the Stamp Act and the next thing you know, the colonists are up in arms. It takes basically from 1763 to 1776 to really get the call for independence. And even then, there's still going to be a faction after the Declaration of Independence is put into effect, the Loyalists, that are still not going to want to have independence from Great Britain. But prior to the Declaration of Independence, the call for independence is mounting, and you have the ideology of the Enlightenment thinkers, which is really looked at by the elite, by Jefferson and by the founding fathers that are going to take that to heart. Benjamin Franklin, they're all going to be very influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers. The common man, the common people in the colonies, they're not going to be able to basically comprehend these Enlightenment ideologies. So that's when we usher in Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. And after Common Sense, which is basically in the vernacular of the common person, it's very easy. It's much easier for them to understand. It makes, well, it's common sense. Get it? Common sense. The call for independence is going to explode. And that's when you're going to eventually have the Declaration of Independence, which is going to be signed 1776 in July of 1776. Now, the war itself, again, just because they called for independence doesn't mean that the British are going to grant them independence. So the war itself, the major turning point of the war, you had Lexington and Concord was the start of it, the start of armed engagement, and even after Lexington and Concord, they're sending an olive branch petition to the king. And all of these petitions and even all the call for repeal and protest, they still have the tone with pledging their allegiance to the king. Again, proving that they are not ready for full-fledged independence. What they want is reform. But by Lexington and Concord, by Bunker Hill, once the king rejects the olive branch petition, armed engagement and full-out war is imminent. And the Americans know that they cannot beat the British outright. There's no way that America could be victorious without foreign help. Usher in the Battle of Saratoga. The victory at Saratoga will then influence the French to come with their money and their navy and their army to help in this call for independence. By 1783, after the Battle of Yorktown, Yorktown is going to be the last battle of the American Revolution, but there's still going to be a few years after Yorktown before the peace is signed in 83. But now you're going to have nation building after the peace is signed. So now the founding documents, like the Declaration, are going to reflect the Enlightenment ideology. So the first founding document we're going to look at is the Articles of Confederation. And I did another video that you could find on the channel on more in depth on the Articles of Confederation. So if you want more content rich on the Articles, check out that video. But the Articles themselves are going to absolutely reflect the two treaties of government by John Locke. They're going to absolutely reflect the 12 years of British enforcement and British tyranny on the American colonies. And they're just going to be a very loose affiliation of states. So these states, what the founders felt that they were not there trying to build a continental nation. Granted, Hamilton and Washington have different views than Jefferson, but they're, for the most part, most of these founders are looking to have 13 autonomous states that are loosely aligned, and that's what the Confederation does. That's what the Articles do. They could not tax, they really could not enforce any laws. The only positive to come really out of it is the land ordinances, which is going to divide up land and come up with a way to distribute land and organize territory for the new United States. In addition to that, they're also going to outlaw slavery in that region. So this is the first time in history where you're starting to see the slave question really coming about on the public side of things. During this time period as well, there's going to be economic and political and social unrest throughout the colonies. And we're going to see that really in Shays' Rebellion, where a group of farmers living in the western sections of Massachusetts, they could not pay their bills, and they were going to debtor's prison as a result of the Revolutionary War, and they called for change. Finally, the Massachusetts militia silence the chorus that is beginning to have those remnants of the American Revolution. And what the colonies then start to see is that something needs to change. Excuse me, the states see that something needs to change. What needs to change is that they see what's happening in Massachusetts, and this is, again, not isolated in Massachusetts. So colonial or state leadership, state legislators, where all the power is vested in. There is no president under the Articles. There's really no court either. So all the power is vested in the legislative body. And what you're going to see, these legislators are going to be fearful that these insurrections can happen in their own colonies. So they call a convention in Annapolis, Maryland, which then is changed to, eventually they go to Philadelphia, and you got the Constitutional Convention and the creation of the Constitution. Now, the Constitution itself is going to be a bundle of compromises, and rightfully so. You're going to still have that Enlightenment ideology entwined and through the ethos of the American culture during this time period, that fear of tyranny, that fear of a consolidated form of government. But they know that having this, giving all the power vested in the states is also not going to work. So they need to come together and they need to figure out a plan that's going to promote democracy throughout the country, but in the same time, create a sense of law and order. And the Constitution is going to have the bundle of compromises. There are going to be vast arguments over population. And if you look at my video, again, through the Articles of Confederation, you're going to see the Constitution as well in there. So, again, look at that for more in-depth analysis of that. But the bundle of compromises, you're going to have federalism, you're going to have separation of power, you're going to have checks and balances, all ways to make sure that a consolidated national government does not hinder on the civil liberties of the people, that the government is derived from the people. Again, Enlightenment ideology is flowing through the American identity during this time period. As a result of this, once the Constitution is created and it's ready to go to ratification to the states, you're going to have different factions coming about, most notably the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And the Federalists are going to put out a bunch of different persuasive essays through the news media of the time period. Remember, there's no Twitter, there's no Instagram, there's no YouTube, there's newspapers, and newspapers were the voice of the people during the time period. And the Federalists and the Anti-Federalist debates are going to be injected into these periodicals. What you're going to see is the Federalist, and Hamilton, most notably, is going to write Hamilton himself is going to write over 50 essays on why the federal government, why the Constitution needs to be ratified. And the Anti-Federalists, their feeling is that there is no Bill of Rights. There is no guarantee. The Federalists argue, well, the states already have a Bill of Rights in their own Constitution. We don't need one for the federal government. In the end, they compromise, and we get a Bill of Rights written by James Madison, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which really, again, reserves power to the states and delegates power to the feds. Okay? And just because there's 10 amendments that are dealing directly with civil liberties, really 8 amendments dealing directly with civil liberties, amendments 9 and 10 are really looking to tell the people, to secure to the people that just because these 8 here are listed doesn't mean that the government is not going to protect all the other civil liberties that people inherit, their unalienable rights they inherit by birth, if you're connecting that back to the Declaration. So those, again, the Enlightenment notions coming up in there. So once the Constitution is signed, once the Constitution is ratified, you're still having these political factions of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and these political factions will eventually give way to all-out political parties during the Washington administration, most notably during the debates over the financial plan done by Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. I did a full-length video on Hamilton's financial plan that, again, for more deeper analysis of the plan, check out that video. But basically what Hamilton is calling for is the assumption of state debt into one consolidated debt of the United States. Therefore, by being able to close out one bank account, so to speak, and opening up another to establish some sort of international credit, global credit. He's also looking to create tariffs to promote American business, and he's also looking to create the Bank of the United States, or the BUS. And the BUS is really going to be bringing up the constitutional questions that Jefferson and the Jeffersonians, which will eventually become the Republicans, what they're looking for in consolidation of power, consolidation of money and authority, all going through this Bank of the United States. And in the end, Hamilton uses the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, to expand the role of the federal government in creating a stable economy through the institution of the Bank of the United States. As we get going through, this is all part of Washington's domestic policy. Another domestic issue that Washington had was the Whiskey Rebellion, whereas Shays' Rebellion proved the ineffectiveness of the Articles of Confederation. The Whiskey Rebellion is going to prove the effectiveness of the U.S. Constitution. It's going to prove that the United States government has the authority to suppress any types of insurrections around these newly developed states, and that it's going to show the strength of government, and it creates a more stable political body in the United States. Washington's foreign policy, you're going to see his neutrality, which is the biggest piece of foreign policy that he's going to have, where you have the French and the British are now fighting a war during the French Revolution, and the United States is being drawn into these wars as a result of maritime trade with both the British and the French. And being that Washington is fearful that if the United States does get involved militarily in this European conflict, that the United States is a struggling, developing nation at this time, and we really can't afford, and we physically can't muster an army to support these groups, and we can't afford to help them monetarily. So the best bet, the best move for the United States is to stay completely neutral and stay out of these entangling European affairs, which again is going to play into the role of the political factions, the political parties of the time period, where you have the Hamiltonians, who are the Federalists. They're going to be very pro-British, and Jefferson and his Republicans are going to be very pro-French. So again, you're going to have the dividing line between the two. After Washington's second term, he sets the precedent not to run for a third term, and then we have the election of 1796, which is won by John Adams. And John Adams now has very big shoes to fill, coming from Washington. He's inheriting this political divide in the American political ethos between Hamilton and Jefferson, and he really believes in Washington's ideology, and he wants to carry on a lot of those policies that Washington has, most specifically neutrality. And that's going to lead to one aspect of Adams's presidency with the XYZ affair. You're going to see where Adams is looking to be diplomatic with the French and not go to war. And he sends an envoy to speak with the French, and the French ignore it. The French insult the American envoy by saying, before we even talk to you about this, you're going to have to, they try to bribe him. And America did not stand for the bribery, and the call for war, the chorus for war, had a very large crescendo during that time period. And what you're going to see Adams do is he's still going to stay out of war. He's still not going to get involved in this European affair, but he is going to create the Navy. He's going to create the American Navy. He's going to start arming merchant vessels, and if need be, have a standing army. Again, this is going to create fear in the Jeffersonians and the Republicans because of the consolidation of power, the showing of authority, their fearing of a standing army. And that's going to lead way into, again, this divide. And you have Jefferson as Adams's vice president because of the 12th Amendment was not ratified during this time period. So the second place winner, so to speak, became vice president. And then that's going to lead to Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts during this conflict. So you're going to have political issues, you're going to have foreign issues, and the Alien and Sedition Act just throws fuel on the fire of those debates, where you're going to have, they're trying to really expel, and they're saying a threat of national security with the Alien Act, with not just the French, but other immigrant groups that are living in North America, because there's fear of they have a fear of internal sabotage, so to speak, during this conflict, and who their allegiance lies with. And in addition to that, you have these immigrant groups that are probably going to vote for the Republicans. So the Federalists see that their party is starting to dwindle out a bit. And by that fear, the Federalist factions have split. So they create these Alien Acts, which is going to try to suppress the voting public of the immigrant groups that would probably vote Republican. And in addition to that, you have the Sedition Act, which you cannot defame publicly or privately or in print or whatever the case may be the federal government, mainly the Federalist Party. That's going to lead to obviously a blowback from the Jefferson Republicans and saying that you're trampling on the First Amendment to the Constitution. So again, playing back into their psyche of a strong consolidated government. That will then lead to the nullification, and it brings up another fundamental question besides state power, but also state rights. And does the state or the federal government, who has more power? Okay, so those two questions are intertwined with each other. And the states' rights question of nullification. Can a state nullify or cancel out an act from Congress that the states feel is unconstitutional? And that's when you get the Kentucky and the Virginia resolutions. So this was really a downfall to the Adams administration. And we're going to see what happens during the election of 1800 coming in for Adams's at the end of his first term, and we have the election of 1800. But that's coming at you next. That'll be done by probably midweek. We'll do a period 4 review. So again, this is ZagsAPush, period 3 review, 1754 through 1800. Remember, strive for the 5. Have a great day.